Rule Britannia is one of the most recognised songs that identifies Great Britain. But what is the history behind the song? Join me in this episode to discover the little-known story of why it was actually written, the real person Britannia was modelled on, and why most people are singing the wrong words. On the 1st of August 1740, at his house at Cliveden, the Prince of Wales was entertained by a performance of a masque, or a musical play. With words by Scottish poets James Thomson and David Mallet, and music by Englishman Thomas Arne, it told the story of Alfred the Great defeating the Vikings. The finale was the victorious Alfred addressing the room with the words, "Britons proceed, the subject deep command, or with your navies, every hostile land." And the chorus replied, "Rule Britannia!" And you know the rest. Or do you? When it was performed to the public in London shortly afterwards, the song became an instant hit. To this day, it symbolises Great Britain and the Royal Navy. It's also a crowd favourite at prom concerts, sporting tournaments, and moments of national celebration. Patriotic British crowds belt it out, "Rule Britannia! Britannia rules the waves!" But they're actually singing the wrong words. When written in 1740, there was no S at the end of rule. It wasn't a boast that Britain rules the waves. It was a call for help, a call for Britain to rule the waves. And rule, not rules, is still the lyric. It's just that as Britain became the world's dominant power in the 19th century, Victorians added the S. Back in 1740, Britain was a power, but not the power, and she shared the waves with many others, all intent on ruling the waves themselves. And nowhere was that competition more fierce than in the seas off North America and the Caribbean. Here the Spanish and French vied with the British for supremacy and trade. And it was trade that interested the British most. Unlike their European rivals, France, Spain, Prussia and Austria, the British were not interested in increasing land holdings on the continent or enhancing their dynasties. For the British, the number one reason to rule the waves was commercial. In short, mastery of the waves would protect existing trade and open doors to new opportunities. And let's be honest, it must also clip the wings of some rivals too. In 1740, when the Prince of Wales heard that call for Britannia to rule the waves, that commercial and trading agenda was under threat. Not only were there rival trading companies such as the Dutch and French East India companies, but those rivals were backed up by their government's navies. And those navies were not just protectors of trading concerns, but were used to prevent the British engaging in free trade, and even more importantly, threatened Britain's very security and freedom. In 1719, for instance, the Spanish had supported an abortive Jacobite invasion of Britain, and only a few years beforehand, so had the French. So forget about commercial shipping. Britannia needed to rule the waves around Britain before foreign powers came knocking. But it was ostensibly the limits on free trade which were to take the British and the Spanish to war in 1739, and provided the backdrop to Rule Britannia a year later. The Spanish had always adopted a protectionist stance towards trade with their huge empire in Central and South America, imposing tariffs on foreign imports and exports. And throughout history, when tariffs are imposed, there are always those who try to get around the restrictions and costs by smuggling. Think brandy smuggling into England in the 18th century or prohibition in the USA. Many British commercial vessels smuggled goods into and out of the Spanish colonies, much to the growing irritation of the authorities in Madrid. Eventually in 1729, a treaty was signed allowing Spain ships to stop and search British merchantmen they suspected of carrying contraband. The Spanish authorities turned this high seas policing over to local coast guards, private operators who were more akin to pirates than customs officials. Paid by results, these Spanish vessels moved from apprehending suspected smugglers to attacking any British merchant ships that came across their path, including those innocently travelling between British ports in the Caribbean and North America. The British ships would then be taken to Spanish-controlled ports where a local judge could always be found to decide in Spain's favour, and the coastguards would be paid their reward. Between 1713 and 1731, 180 English ships were pillaged or confiscated by the Spanish. In 1731, things came to a head when a Spanish coastguard ship operating off the coast of their colony of Florida intercepted a British merchant ship, the Rebecca, suspected of carrying illegal contraband. Upon boarding the Rebecca, the Spaniards did indeed find that she was carrying an illegal cargo of sugar. In a rather heated discussion, the British captain of the Rebecca, Robert Jenkins, was tied to the mast of his ship and his ear cut off. He returned to London lamenting this high-handed Spanish behaviour, but found little sympathy. Prime Minister Robert Walpole's overriding policy was peace, not war, and Captain Jenkins' loss was not worth undermining that policy for. But through the 1730s, more and more British ships were boarded, and the lone voice of Jenkins had now become an angry clamour. Fast forward to 1738, and Jenkins found himself in front of a House of Commons committee, which was exploring cases of the Spanish interfering with British ships. After lamenting his woes, Jenkins then, with a flourish, produced his severed ear. Parliamentary politicians and the press suddenly arose in indignation. Tensions swiftly rose, and war broke out over a severed ear from a merchant who had basically been caught smuggling. Now, more cynical heads would say that this war had a lot less to do with the cause of Robert Jenkins, and a lot more to do with the parliamentary enemies of Robert Walpole, trying to undermine Britain's first and to this day longest-serving Prime Minister. That political skullduggery was also a hidden agenda in the story of Rule Britannia, but more about that in a little while. A fleet under Admiral Vernon set sail for the Caribbean, and in 1739 Britain declared war on Spain, the War of Jenkins' Ear. And it was against the backdrop of this war that Rule Britannia was first performed. No wonder it was adopted with such enthusiasm and patriotic fervour by the general public. As far as the war was concerned, following a successful capture of Portobello in Panama, celebrated by the Portobello area of Edinburgh and Portobello Road in London, Vernon then suffered a decisive defeat at Cartagena in modern-day Colombia. Over the next couple of years, the war produced no significant battles or results, apart from a battle between the Spanish colony of Florida and the British colony of Georgia. And in 1743, this slightly bizarre war was absorbed into a more significant War of Austrian Succession back in Europe. The irony was that just when Alfred was imploring the Prince of Wales and the rest of Britain to rule the waves and never be slaves, the British were at the pinnacle of their transatlantic slave trade. Between 1726 and 1800, it is estimated that British ships transported over 2 million Africans across the Atlantic. And therein lies some people's problems with this patriotic song. They see it as Britons not wanting to be slaves, whilst happily enslaving others. You might well think that the two can't easily be divorced, and maybe from a 21st century perspective, you're correct. But let's go back to 1740, when it was written. Because it wasn't written as a triumphant song about British imperialism and enslaving others, but actually as a call for the British government and the Royal Navy to defend freedom of travel, freedom of trade, and in a narrative that we don't easily understand nowadays, freedom from tyrannical rule, whether domestic or foreign. That was the slavery that the song was referring to. It was about defending British liberties and freedoms, won over countless centuries, ever since the signing of the Magna Carta. And the prevailing attitude in Britain at that time was that those perceived liberties needed to be protected, not by the army, but by the Royal Navy. The Royal Navy? Surely it was Britain's redcoats who would protect them. Not if you were around in 1740, because ever since Oliver Cromwell, the British population had viewed a standing army with concern. Just 80 years before Rule Britannia, Cromwell had used his new model army to create a dictatorship in Britain. So put that into a bit of perspective. That's the same timescale between World War II and the present day. So it was just about still within living memory. And for those Brits too young to remember Oliver Cromwell at the time, they only had to look across the Channel to see how the French, Spanish and other European rulers, or despots as the British referred to them, used their armies to enforce their rule. Consequently, successive governments reflecting public opinion kept the British army as small as possible. In the 1720s, it had been reduced to just 17,000 men. Indeed, it was so small that whenever a crisis had appeared during the early Georgian period, the British had to call upon foreign mercenaries, principally Dutch and Hessians from Germany, to augment their ranks. To further dilute the power of this small army, virtually no barracks were built, forcing most soldiers to be billeted in private homes. As General Wade wrote when advocating more barracks after the 1715 Jacobite revolt, "The people of the kingdom have been taught to associate the idea of barracks and slavery so close together." There's that word slavery again. Small numbers and dispersed soldiers might be good for preventing a military takeover of the country, but they were not good for defending it against foreign enemies. Even though the army was strengthened for the War of Jenkins' Ear, it numbered 30,000, as against 190,000 in the Spanish army, and 10 times their number in France. So if the army had to be kept small to prevent a military dictatorship, and yet it was too small to oppose a foreign enemy, how could the British people be protected from becoming slaves to a tyrannical ruler, be they homemade or a foreigner? Surrounded by sea, the answer was obvious: the Royal Navy. Time and time again in the past, her ships had intercepted and defeated foreign invading armies long before they reached the shores of England. So, both to defend Britain and to keep the army neutered, that call for Britannia to rule the waves made popular sense. But the problem in 1740 was that she certainly did not rule the waves, and she was now at war with a long-time enemy, Spain, who would soon be joined by another old foe, France. And whilst larger than her European rivals, when war with Spain broke out in 1739, only 2/3, or 80, of the Royal Navy's 124 50-gun ships were fit for service. The Spanish and French between them had 91. And the ships of those two nations were, certainly on paper, a match for the British. Unlike in the future, the Royal Navy possessed no advantage in ship design, armaments, gunnery skills or seamanship. Indeed, it was the Dutch in the mid-1600s and then the French coming into the early 18th century who'd operated the better navies. And her senior commanders were long past their best. The First Lord of the Admiralty was 73, whilst the Commander-in-Chief of the Channel Fleet was 79. And just for good measure, the organisation and provision of the Navy was an administrative nightmare, with different boards looking after construction, provision and recruitment. With the Royal Navy in many respects not fit for purpose, Britannia certainly did not rule the waves. Which leads us to another question. Exactly who, or what, was Britannia? Britannia was the name given to the island of Great Britain, that's Scotland, England and Wales, by the Romans. Originally called Albion by the Romans, they took the Greek name of Britannia and adopted it to Britannia and applied it to the island, or more precisely, to the part that they actually governed. And Britannia, the island, was given a personality within 100 years of the Roman occupation. Britannia, the personality, was a woman wearing a centurion's helmet and a toga, with her right breast exposed, holding a spear and either sitting by or standing on the sea. She was even depicted on the reverse of coins issued during Emperor Hadrian's reign in the early 100s. With the arrival of the Anglo-Saxons, the term Britannia and the woman that personified the island fell out of use, although not entirely in Brythonic-speaking areas such as Wales. It wasn't until the reign of Queen Elizabeth I, nearly 1,000 years later, that she made a reappearance in England. But even then, she remained in the shadow of the Virgin Queen. There can only be one star of the show. It was with the arrival on the English throne of the Scottish Stuarts that Britannia once again made her mark. The ascension of King James VI of Scotland as King James I of England resulted in a highly popular pageant being performed in London entitled Triumphs of a Reunited Britannia. But it was James's grandson, Charles II, that brought Britannia centre stage in British culture. Following the Second Anglo-Dutch War, King Charles II ordered a medal to be struck to commemorate the Peace of Breda. On the reverse was an image of Britannia, bareheaded, with a spear and a shield bearing the Union flag. According to Samuel Pepys, the face of Britannia was actually modelled on a real person, Frances Stuart, Duchess of Richmond. The 30-year-old was a prominent member of the Restoration Court, and her beauty led to her to being called La Belle Stuart. King Charles was certainly attracted to her, and rumours went further, suggesting that they did indeed have an affair, and possibly even an illegitimate child. Duchess Frances's image was also used as the image of Britannia on the reverse of copper coins issued a few years later in 1672. Britannia has appeared on British coins ever since, most recently on the 50p coin. So, in everyone's purse or wallet, Britannia was back as a symbol of Britain. And just over 70 years after Frances Stuart posed for those coins and medals, Britannia was now being urged to rule the waves. By the Victorian period, Britannia now brandished a trident, replacing Neptune as god of the seas, with a Union flag on her shield, and often she was seen standing in water to denote the oceans she now ruled, accompanied by a lion. Oh, and there was one more alteration. The Victorians, prudes that they were, covered up her breast. Finally, after just over 100 years being two separate countries but sharing the same monarchs, the Act of Union of 1707 brought England and Scotland together as the Kingdom of Great Britain. And with that union, the symbol of Britannia became increasingly important in trying to create a common bond between the once two separate kingdoms. She became the symbol of something ancient and yet at the same time something new. It's no surprise that it was two Scots who penned the poem whose lyrics are belted out at last night at the proms. With their old kingdom no more, and determined not to be absorbed into a greater England, many Scots saw Britannia and Great Britain as an identity that they could sign up to. Likewise, the German-born Prince of Wales also wanted to embrace Britannia. Indeed, the whole performance of Alfred at the Prince's house at Cliveden was part of a wider and forgotten political agenda. The 33-year-old Prince Frederick had come to London when his father ascended the throne as George II in 1728. The performance of Alfred marked the anniversary of the ascension of his grandfather, George I, to the throne, and also the third birthday of his daughter, Princess Augusta. Notably absent from the performance was his father, the King. Why? Because father and son were barely on speaking terms. As he distanced himself from his father, likewise the prince distanced himself from his father's chief or prime minister, Robert Walpole. And if you recall, Walpole's foreign policy had been to avoid wars, and as he was the king's man, that policy reflected on the king too. The prince, by supporting Alfred and his calls for Britannia to rule the waves, was aligning himself with his father and Walpole's political opponents. And of course it was partly to weaken Britain's first and longest serving Prime Minister that his enemies, and friends of the Prince of Wales, had made Robert Jenkins a cause to finally go to war with Spain. In fact, when war was declared, the Prince took great delight in rubbing both his father's and Walpole's noses in the dirt by toasting jubilant crowds outside a tavern. Walpole's policies of avoiding taking sides in previous European conflicts and sometimes wriggling out of the commitments to do so had cost him political capital across the continent. And when the War of Jenkins' Ear broke out in 1739, he and Britain found themselves without any supporters. Once more, that call for Britannia to rule the waves sounded more like an alarm call than a triumphant song. Make yourself strong, because you ain't got any friends who are going to help you out in a tight spot. It wouldn't have been missed on the King, Walpole, and the movers and shakers in British politics that Alfred had urged Britannia to rule the waves at the Prince of Wales's house. It was a very public political rebuke to the nation's leaders. Within 2 years, Walpole was driven from office. The political winds were blowing with Britannia. When Thomson and Mallet wrote the words and Thomas Arne penned the music, Rule Britannia wasn't a triumphant boasting statement. Instead, it was a clarion call to the nation's leadership to step up to ensure free trade and ensure Britain could not be subjected by, as they saw them, despots, modelled on the French and Spanish kings. Rule Britannia either galvanised policy or maybe it simply reflected it. But either way, over the next 20 years, the Royal Navy was rapidly expanded, so that by 1760 it was 25% bigger than the French and Spanish fleets combined. And that investment was to pay dividends when, at the Battle of Quiberon Bay, the Royal Navy devastated a French fleet, destroying French plans to land a 100,000 strong army on the south coast of England. Britons, it seemed, would never be slaves to a tyrannical government, and the cry to rule the waves had been answered. Well, I hope you enjoyed that story. Plenty more coming soon, but in the meantime, why not watch another one of my videos now? And if you'd like to support my channel, then please consider becoming a patron or a member. There's details in the description below. And a big thanks to Lester, Daniel and Ian for your recent support. Thanks for joining me today. Keep well, and I'll see you again very soon.